Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
There's this period in 1962 where on the exact same day, the film adaptation of Dr. No is released and the Beatles' first single, Love Me Do, is released. And it's like these are the two totemic parts of British culture that dominate the 60s. The Beatles arguably still untouched really in the pop music pantheon. And Bond, still continually reinvents itself and it becomes one of Britain's great cultural exports.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to Cold War history. Please make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. Fraser McCullum is the author of a new book, Cold War Britain, 50 Years in the Shadow of the Bomb, which gives a fascinating insight into a period that shaped the fabric of British society. Cold War Britain is an exploration into the multifaceted dimensions of Britain's experience during the Cold War era. By weaving together history, politics, literature and popular culture, the book invites readers to immerse themselves in the vibrant tapestry of Cold War Britain, offering fresh insights and perspectives into how this global conflict shaped the fabric of British society. I'm delighted to welcome Fraser McCullum to our Cold War conversation.
I'd often go to bookstores and look in the Cold War section, and there are loads of great books on the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Berlin and the Cold War. But there was never one that really centred Britain, and working in the Imperial War Museum, I've become very conscious of how little younger folks especially know the importance of Britain in that Cold War story. They see it very much as an American and Soviet conflict, which of course is broadly true, but there are so many stories that Britain is particularly important to, especially in the early stages of the Cold War, that I felt needed to have a light shone on them. So that was the genesis. And then, of course, it's a conflict that has so many tangents and threads that are political, military-based, cultural, social. So it's such a fascinating conflict that I thought it was a good opportunity to try and pull some of that stuff together.
I think that's one of the things that really appeals to me about the book is how you pull all those different strands, such as the cultural strand in there. Because for me, the Cold War is not just a military confrontation, it's the changes in society that occur as well during the period. And I love the way you weave those in. It's not like a separate chapter. It's put in within the narrative there.
To get into the making of the book almost is one of the changes that happened from conception to delivery was that originally there was a chapter on culture, but I've become very aware as you're starting to put the thing together or think about it a bit more deeply that one of the things that defines the Cold War for me is that the cultural stuff weaves its way through every single aspect. So there would be no point to me in doing a chapter on culture that would go from portrayals of Churchill to spies to post-apocalyptic, science fiction films. It just felt like it is part of the story all the way through. And that's the real thing for me is the Cold War impacts everybody. And of course, that's true of the Second World War and the First World War as well for to a large degree. But this impacts everybody at every stage of life, even sometimes when they don't realise it, and for such a long period, for the best part of 50 years. And it covers, high politics to the most broad popular version of popular culture.
So the first chapter sets the scene, the end of World War II, the start of the Cold War. And I learned a lot from this book. I mean, for example, I did not know that George Orwell was the first one to coin the term Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone's interested in this period, if you can get into the find the Orwell archives from Tribune, which you can find online, you don't have to go to a library or an archive to come across these. There's so much in these sort of op-eds that he'd write for Tribune. And one of them is this phrase Cold War that he essentially coins. And that's part of what I'm talking about in terms of Britain's impact on the Cold War. A British writer names it. A British politician, Winston Churchill, of course, essentially kicks it off with the Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946. even the phrase atomic weapons is from H.G. Wells, much earlier, a book from 1913, 1914, that's a kind of period, but that's where atomic weapons comes from. So these are really fundamental things to how we think about the Cold War and how the Cold War's framed, and they're all British.
And that Fulton, Missouri speech is an interesting one for me because he says the Iron Curtain runs from Stettin to Trieste. Now, looking at the map, he's talking about Germany, the whole of Germany, not being behind the Iron Curtain at that point.
Yeah, I mean, there's still this kind of hope that, you know, a united Germany can be brought into the west side of the border, which obviously, you know, doesn't happen, and it completely changes how we think of that speech. But that speech is one of the most important ones that Churchill ever gives, and given his back catalogue, that's quite a statement, right? But I love all the stories around it. I love that, you know, so I understand there's, you know, dissenting views on Churchill, but one of the things I think everyone can agree on is his the power of his speech making. But the thing is, I think sometimes when you listen to them, including that one, you know, it's a bit mumbly and a bit drony. This isn't Martin Luther King or Barack Obama or somebody that, you know, really fills the room. But it's the quality of the words. And the key thing is, and I just mentioned Barack Obama, for all that his speeches are great, I know the names of his speechwriters, right? They have podcasts and they're pretty well known. Whereas I think it's important people understand that Churchill is the prime author of his speeches. Now, of course, he has help, but he is the prime author. And there are these stories of Truman's aides rushing around trying to find Churchill in the days running up to the delivery speech to sort out logistics and maybe to see a draft. And Churchill's people will say, oh, he's writing the speech. And they're just dumbfounded because as they see it, politicians don't write speeches, they just deliver them. And Churchill pores over every single word. Truman, of course, famously is enthralled to Churchill in a way that FDR never had been, as close as they were. And he sort of is reluctant to even look at the speech, and he eventually takes a peek at it and realises this is going to be a real sort of, you know, earth-shattering moment. So the stories around that trip and the time they spend on the train drinking and playing cards and discussing the state of the world, those stories themselves are great. I mean, there are books on this if you want to check it out, but that's a really interesting snapshot of that really early stage where you're, you know, essentially still in the Second World War period. We're only months removed from the end of the war in August of 45. This is February 46. And of course, Churchill's out of power and actually quite despondent, and it's actually really kind of kicks off the next stage of his political life.
Because I think it's also in that speech is the first mention of the special relationship.
Absolutely. And as we're recording this, President Trump has just visited Windsor Castle, and there's been a whole big sort of demonstration of the special relationship. And I think both he and King Charles have referenced it in their addresses. It's still something that we battle with today. I think if you go to America, you wouldn't know such a thing exists. I don't think they're particularly conscious of the phrase, but it's absolutely a phrase that has defined Anglo-American relations ever since 1946.
Absolutely. Now, as you said, Churchill's out of power. Clement Attlee is in Labour landslide in 1945. Britain is diminishing or is diminished as a power. They're accepting money from the Marshall Plan. I think they get the largest amount from the Marshall Plan. But even having that special relationship, they are locked out of the nuclear secrets.
Yeah, absolutely. Churchill and Roosevelt had worked kind of in secret on this, and they'd made the Hyde Park Agreement and various other things to share all knowledge, to not use the bomb without the other one's written consent. But after FDR dies and Churchill's out of power, it's all gone. I mean, the Americans conveniently lose their copy of the Hyde Park Agreement. Brian McMahon, an American politician, spearheads what becomes known as the McMahon Act, the Atomic Energy Act, which locks all competing nations out of America's atomic program. And Britain fights really hard to get back in. And the great irony of all this, of course, is that the early stage of the atomic program is largely British. So many of the advancements are made in Britain. We're in Manchester recording this at University of Manchester, is where the atom, of course, is split. by Ernest Rutherford, a New Zealander, but of course part of the Empire at that time. So de facto a British achievement. And then, of course, the early work at the Tube Alloys program, the early research by British scientists into atomic energy all takes place largely in Wales, actually. Britain makes great advancements in the field of atomic energy and weaponizing the atom. But ultimately, we don't have the resources. We are still, in this case, under threat of invasion, still fighting. Because so 1940, 1941, the Second World War still looks very bleak for Britain at this point. We do not have the resources, the manpower, and certainly not the money to dedicate to the program. And eventually it's folded in with what becomes the Manhattan Project. And of course, many of these scientists from Britain go over to Los Alamos and the other sites and work on that program. So central to the program are British scientists, and then shut out of it completely. So a real sort of demonstration of Britain's diminished status as becoming basically a second-tier power, having been the most dominant power in politics for the last 150 years.
But then Britain decides it's got to have its own nuclear weapons. I think Nye Bevan comes out with this brilliant quote, we need the bomb and we need it with a Union Jack on top.
Yeah, Nye Bevan has a meeting with the American Secretary of State, and is really spoken down to and is humiliated, and he is a man of bluster and very impressive figure, and he comes back and tells the cabinet that he will not allow another British Foreign Secretary to be spoken to, and we must have this thing over here and us have the bloody Union Jack on top of it, is the phrase attributed to him. So they go all out essentially to acquire atomic weapons and actually develop their own.
And so there's the testing in Australia and on Easter Island, and 1952, is it the first successful test of a British nuclear weapon?
Yeah, and it's a real achievement because given the financial dire straits that Britain is in, to pull that off in a relatively short space of time is massively impressive. Of course, and I think this is a real issue, live issue at the moment, because there's been a lot of coverage of it. A lot of guys are very ill as a result. They test these weapons without much thought to the long-term consequences, and there's still an ongoing campaign for justice for these folks. And I think that's really important to highlight, and that work is out there just now. They eventually demonstrate the dropping of the bomb in islands off Australia. It's a real vicious display of the power of the atomic bomb. Of course, though, by the time this happens, the world's already moving on. And this is part of the story with Britain's atomic weapons program, is it's always just that little bit behind. By this point, the work has already moved on to the hydrogen bomb. And listeners that have seen, Oppenheimer will be very aware of the debates that took place in the United States around that. The same debates happening in Britain. And by the time Churchill is now back in power, having not really known anything about the atomic weapons development program, sort of decides we have to keep up and go with the hydrogen bomb option as well.
And Britain needs a delivery system to actually be able to drop this over the Soviet Union. So the V-bombers are commissioned, the most famous of which is the Vulcan. But it's apparent that Soviet air defense is going to be a lot stronger than what they'd originally anticipated. So they're looking for a way to launch a missile from a plane. They developed Blue Streak, but they're also after this American system called Skybolt.
Yeah, a few things happen. I mean, there's various iterations of these missiles that are going to be launched from aircraft. The Valiant, the Victor, and the Vulcan, the 3 V-bombers, are extraordinary aircraft. The Valiant doesn't hold up very well to the altitudes it has to fly at, and I think there's only one left intact in the world. But Victor and the Vulcan are both really impressive, and they have long lifespans, but they don't do what they're designed to do. They are designed to deliver the nuclear bomb. The Victor essentially becomes a refueling plane, and the Vulcan becomes a sort of conventional long-range bomber and sees action all the way up to it's actually probably most famous for its action in the Falklands, over 20 years after it was sort of at its peak. But the key thing with the Vulcan is that it really captures the imagination of British children, airfix modelers. I mean, it's such a futuristic-looking aircraft, and it ties into this point where, we're talking about the decline of Britain, but there's this little window where it does feel like Britain's about to lead the world in jet aircraft, and it's such a short-lived thing. All kind of falls apart. The Vulcan becomes outdated in terms of what it's designed for. The de Havilland Comet, the conventional commercial airliner, fails, and it's again just another snapshot of the decline of British power. They struggle with all these different, trying to keep up to date with the various different missile delivery systems, and Skybolt seems to be the big saviour, and they negotiate with the Kennedy administration to buy Skybolt. But the Americans are having similar issues with Skybolt. Is the cost overruns are unbelievable. I mean, it takes way too long. In Britain, there's always this real conflict between the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy had been the prime service going, all the way back to the time of Nelson and even further. Again, the post-Second World War era, the success of Spitfires and Hurricanes and Lancaster bombers kind of gives primacy to the Royal Air Force for this little window. In the States, they don't have the same debate, and they sort of come up with the idea that actually missiles launched from nuclear submarines is the future. And eventually we are kind of forced into not taking Skybolt, and in return we're given access to the American nuclear submarine program, which is, of course, Polaris, which really changes the game entirely and returns primacy of the British services back to the Royal Navy, which it's never really went back from since.
Now, earlier we were talking about the British scientists who worked at Los Alamos coming back and helping with the British nuclear program. Now, amongst those is a certain Klaus Fuchs.
Yes. Klaus Fuchs has become the most famous of them all. He does contribute to the program in Los Alamos, but that's not what he's known for now. Of course, he's now known as one of the many scientists in that program that were passing information back to the Soviets. And it was a real scandal when it broke, and it had the potential to really torpedo the Anglo-American relationship here.
Absolutely. And chapter 3, always a popular one, sex, scandal and spy games. Probably got all the most popular nouns there to get people to read that. But, you obviously cover Cambridge 5. Great to see George Blake in there, because I think often that story is not told, or the Portland spy story, which I think is a really interesting one, with the Krogers living in their bungalow in Ruislip.
Yeah. Living a very normal life and have this extraordinary backstory, which was turned into movies, kind of long forgotten now. It's not one of the kind of ones held up as a great spy film of the 60s, but it's absolutely worth checking out.
Yeah, Ring of Spies, I think it's called. Yeah, do check that out. And then you get onto Profumo, which, again, those nouns there probably sum up the whole of the Profumo
Absolutely.
affair.
That's really what we're talking about with that. But the other thing to remember is this is a time, as we move into the 60s, a time of real social change. And that's not, that's not fresh, hot take, right? But it really needs to be, people need to remember it. And people think about, think of the King's Road and Swing in London and that sort of thing. Well, that's a tiny part of it. But there's this long run up to that kind of more liberal Britain that emerges in the late 60s. One of those things is the decriminalisation of homosexuality, which doesn't happen shamefully till 1967. But people need to understand that a lot of these spy scandals, a lot of these people that were turned into traitors, essentially, were gay. And at the time, the press would publish that as, promote that as, well, homosexuals can't be trusted, they're deviant, they're inclined to be traitors. But of course, the reality is that because being openly gay was illegal, they were ripe for blackmail. And this, of course, happens, particularly with the Vassal affair. John Vassal was not really a particularly good guy. He's not someone who should hold up as a hero. He was vain. He was, very arrogant. He liked the trappings that came with the money that he got from spying for the Soviets. But the only reason he ended up spying for the Soviets is he was honey-trapped in a homosexual liaison. And that's, it's not necessarily the case with Philby and Burgess and some of these the Cambridge spies who had either were gay or at least had bisexual relationships back in their university days. But there becomes this sort of mass hysteria around homosexuality. and spying, which at the same time, the inquiries that become the Wolfson Report, which then ultimately lead to the decriminalisation of homosexuality in 1967. The great irony, of course, is that probably the most famous spy scandal, and the one that had the potential to be the most serious, is an entirely classic, sleazy, heterosexual government affair that you would recognise from, throughout history, and that's, of course, the Profumo scandal, which touches on everything, right? It touches on race relations, it touches on fear of communism, it touches on the decline of the establishment and the increasing lack of deference in society. It brings in the great satire boom of the 60s. So it's a really, it's a really fascinating little snapshot. And at the core of it is this Cold War paranoia, this idea that the Minister for War has had an affair with a woman who's also allegedly sleeping with the Soviet naval attaché. And of course, that just is ripe for salacious rumour mongering and scandal.
It's a great story. I need to do an episode on the Profumo affair. It's a big gap in my espionage canon of episodes. Now, this fascination with spies also gets into culture as well, because you're starting to get the James Bond films, the Harry Palmer films. Le Carré is writing his novels. Len Deighton. I mean, I must admit, Harry Palmer's probably my favourite one. I'm a Bond fan, I would say, but Harry Palmer, I love the style of those movies.
The original Ipcress File film, I've not seen the recent TV version, but the Ipcress File movie that makes one of the many films in a row that makes Michael Caine this huge 60s icon is a great film and is the anti-Bond, really. But Bond, though, is the key one because of its international reach. Again, we've talked about Britain being in a period of decline. I've referenced Swinging London that will come later in the 60s, but there's this period in 1962 where on the exact same day, the film adaptation of Dr. No is released and the Beatles' first single, Love Me Do, is released. And it's like these are the two totemic parts of British culture that dominate the 60s. The Beatles arguably still untouched, really, in the pop music pantheon. And Bond, still, we're waiting the announcement of who the next Bond will be. It's made something like $11 billion over the past 60 years at the box office. It continually reinvents itself, and it becomes one of Britain's great cultural exports. Of course, the Bond movies have their roots in the novels written by Ian Fleming, who could take it back further, has worked in espionage during the Second World War, and there's whole loads of great stories there around mincemeat and all these sort of things. That's obviously for another podcast. But the Fleming novels undergo this huge transformation because if you read them, and there's still worth in them, some of them are really good, but they are suffused with incredible snobbery, very, very racist, and incredibly misogynistic. Now, the Bond films obviously have elements of that, and certainly the misogyny is part of the early ones in a way that doesn't survive to the kind of recent Daniel Craig version. But the films become much lighter, much more confident, much breezier. Even the more serious ones, like From Russia with Love, which is a proper sort of Cold War espionage thriller, have a lightness of touch that isn't there in the novels, and that really comes down to the initial director, Terence Young, who's also an inveterate snob, but is very keen on style, and the actor Sean Connery, who brings obviously muscular charisma, but also an easygoing charm. And these films become sensations. But the other thing is that they inspire all these other things. So Len Deighton, who had written some great non-fiction books around the Second World War, actually quite provocative, some of them, and absolutely worth reading. But he also has this huge canon of spy books, and he has this unnamed operative who becomes known as Harry Palmer in the Ipcress File, played by Michael Caine. He becomes another, 60s icon, but very, very different to Bond. And as you said, at the same time, Jean le Carré is writing his novels, which become adapted slightly later. First of all, the Spy Who Could Bring Home the Cold, which is my favourite of all the espionage films. I could talk at length about that movie and the novel. And of course, later on in the 1970s, they do the sort of definitive mini-series of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. But there are loads of others. You end up with these knockoff versions like The Man from U.N.C.L.E. There are loads of kind of spy stories. The Mission Impossible series in America comes out of this fad. There is a huge spy boom to the point where they bring out lots of toys and things that kids would get at Christmas. Toys that they were still making when I was a kid in the 80s, little James Bond spy sets in a suitcase, which you could probably still get now, but certainly in the 1980s they were still exactly the same as they were in 1964.
I think I had one of those. Never knew what happened to that. You also cover an area of the Cold War which I think is sometimes forgotten about, certainly not by service people that have served in it, but the hot wars, the conflicts where the British Army was involved in fighting or peacekeeping, or where they were in the line of fire.
Yeah, I mean, the Cold War is never really cold. If you've got friends from Asia, for example, the notion of a Cold War is a faintly ridiculous one if you're from Cambodia or Vietnam or Korea. If you've got friends that lived in East Germany or had family that lived in East Germany, again, very, very different. In Britain, of course, it feels like a Cold War, but what we need to remember is that there are, over the peace, probably tens of thousands of British servicemen involved in action around the globe. A lot of these have been forgotten about, sometimes out of shame. They're actually maybe enveloped by the whole concept of decolonialisation and the breakup of the empire, which is a bigger story than some of these individual conflicts, but they all feed into it. So you've got British servicemen in Germany from essentially the end of the Second World War until the early to mid-90s. You've got people fighting in Korea, which is a really vicious war, obviously never really declared as a war. It's technically a police action. If you talk to anyone in America knows it's a police action. Never really comes to an end. We still live with the consequences on that border and the tensions that exist around particularly North Korea. But it's a really vicious war fought in blazing hot sun and icy cold. The death toll is really large across the Allied forces, even worse for the Korean civilians. And of course, there's a lot of what we know as North Korean troops and Chinese troops die as well. There's all these other relatively small in relation. And you've got to bear in mind we're in the Cold War period is very much in the shadow of the Second World War. So when we describe these as small wars in relation to the Second World War, they are tiny, but they are vicious and they don't feel tiny if you're fighting in them. And the consequences, especially for the folks that live in those countries, are really severe. But you've got British troops in Cyprus, you've got British troops in Malaya, you've got British troops in Kenya, you've got British troops in Aden. And all these things, some of them are major news stories at the time, some of them much less so. I mean, the coverage of Aden, for example, is actually relatively small, even at the time, despite the fact that some big figures come out of these conflicts. Of course, the one that really is probably central to the whole overarching story is Britain's somewhat misbegotten adventure in Egypt around the Suez Canal, and that is one that certainly is not a small story at the time. The coverage of that was huge, and it sees one of the first really major anti-war protests that take place in Britain, and particularly in London, that we are now used to seeing throughout. But Suez is probably the one that defines it all. But they say there are many, many others, and it's really important to me that working for the Imperial War Museum, you come across folks all the time asking for information or stories on those conflicts, and they are sort of shamefully, I think, not necessarily by the museum, but overall, kind of underrepresented.
Absolutely, and I'd agree with that. I mean, Suez is a subject I've wanted to cover for a while, and I need to have a look at that. I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting is how close Britain comes to involvement in the Vietnam War, which is probably the conflict within the Cold War that most people are familiar with, and how the Labour Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, had to sort of manage the special relationship in a way that the US didn't want us to be.
Yeah, it's really focused around the time that Lyndon Johnson's president, the escalation of the Vietnam War. There's not massive pressure for British involvement during the Kennedy years, where that is, people can debate how active America truly is in the Vietnam War at that point. But certainly by the time Johnson has succeeded Kennedy after his assassination and after the Gulf of Tonkin, and things start to escalate, particularly as you move into the 65 to 67 period. Johnson's putting serious pressure on British politicians, and particularly as he was dealing with Harold Wilson. And famously, Lyndon Johnson's incredibly persuasive, right? Almost bullying. The Johnson treatment's a real factor in his how he treats, other folks in American politics. And he doesn't quite do the same with Wilson, but he is on at him all the time on the telephone. He's even asking him just to send, like a military band. It's not so much that he wants British firepower. He wants the perception of a broader coalition. And of course, the Australians, for example, send quite a lot of troops in Australia. The Vietnam War is a pretty significant conflict in their military history. And, again, part of the Commonwealth. So there's a link there, but Wilson, I mean, you could do a whole series of episodes on Wilson and the Cold War. I mean, the guy's obviously accused of being suspected of being a Soviet spy by people. There's all sorts of scurrilous rumours around him. But he's a really savvy politician, and he really stands firm. Like he resists consistently the pressure. And I say the pressure from Johnson is intense. And he's very good at applying pressure, but Wilson resists and keeps Britain out of Vietnam, which is probably one of his sort of defining part of his legacy, really. That doesn't mean that Britain isn't impacted by the Vietnam War. Clearly, later on, we're all aware of the cultural stuff that goes around there, and the Vietnam War, something that a lot of people in Britain are interested in. But at the time, there's huge demonstrations in Grosvenor Square. In fact, beyond demonstrations, they become riots. And it's all tied up with the student movements and the peace movements that are around the world and around Europe at the time. It's, it's the same time that's happening. There's things going on in Prague and in Paris and all these things. A really great book called 1968 by an author called Mark Kurlansky. It's out a few years ago. Hopefully it's still in print. Which really demonstrates the global nature of this protest movement. But Britain absolutely sees pretty violent reactions to the Vietnam War in London, despite the fact we're never in.
And that sort of neatly leads us on to your chapter 5 in here about protest and popular culture. I mean, I'm less familiar with the Vietnam War demonstrations because they occurred when I was just about in primary school. So, but I was very much aware during my formative years of C&D, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and the rise of the peace movement in the UK.
So CND, again, that CND logo that I'm sure everyone can just picture in their head, that is based on the semaphore signs for CN and D, is a British invention again. The CND logo is designed by a British artist called Gerald Holtham, which he allows free use of. I mean, he could have made a fortune off of licensing it, but he's obviously a much better person than most of us. The CND campaign comes out the late 1950s. A lot of sort of celebrity activists, Bertrand Russell and a lot of actors and various other people involved in it. But it becomes this mass movement, and they do these marches that go from London to Aldermaston, and they eventually reverse them. These huge marches every Easter, and they become these kind of cultural events, and they diminish through time a little bit as the perception of the nuclear threat fades. But the influence of CND lasts all the way through the Cold War, and you end up with sort of the Greenham Common protests in the 1980s, in particular, around the American bases in England, which have become these iconic moments because they're really heavily photographed. And the key thing about them is that they're 98% of the people there are women. It's basically a women's movement. So you see these women of all different backgrounds. You see people you'd expect there, right? Proper hippie women. But you also see housewives and students and elderly people. It's a real broad constituency of women and the visuals of them in their everyday clothes doing, chain link protests and holding hands and holding placards in front of these really remarkably frightening metal fences behind which sit, weapons of devastation, is a really powerful image. and makes it really hard for people to criticize them because it's no longer, you know, Reds and commies and liberals and lefties and trade unionists. It's your mum, your gran, your sister, and it's really, really powerful. I was talking to somebody recently who'd been a Royal Air Force police officer, and he told me that there were, at certain points, there were American personnel, they had orders that if the perimeter was breached, they were to open fire. And these women had, like, they'd shake the fence, and then the fence comes down, and they start to make their way in. And these RAF police officers managed to contain it, but these women didn't know how. I mean, they were really meters and seconds away from catastrophe. And I didn't know that story until somebody told me it in a conversation we had in it. So, lest it be thought that these people were just singing and chanting and making nice placards and doing that, they were actually in real danger. And their influence is huge. People still talk about that generation. We did an exhibition at the museum a few years ago about peace movements from the First World War up to the Iraq War. But the bit that absolutely resonated the most was the Greenham Common stuff. And I think it's largely due to, again, the type of folks that were doing it and the imagery that comes out of it. There's a load of great anti-war art from that period. I'm a huge fan of the artist Peter Kennard, who does some incredible, powerful visual work that became posters and covers to, protest magazines and you see on placards at demonstrations. And he's still active today. He's very active in protesting the conflict in Israel, with Israel and Palestine at the moment. But his Cold War stuff is incredibly powerful. So he'll take iconography and twist it. So he'll, use like a nuclear missile and shatter it through the CND logo, or he takes real classic works of art and manipulates them to show the ridiculousness of nuclear conflict, but also the terror of it. One of the great pieces is the Protect and Survive booklet, which is a huge thing, again, for folks of a certain age. Like, it's such an iconic booklet. He has a version of that, an artwork called Protect and Survive, which is essentially a skeleton reading the Protect and Survive booklet, which is a booklet about how to protect yourself from nuclear war, which is a kind of ridiculous piece of government propaganda that artwork that Kennard did really puts that in focus.
I produced a podcast for the Imperial War Museum on the women's peace movement a number of years back. I think it's still on the website somewhere.
I'm sure it will be, and people should check that out.
I'll put a link to that. Now, there's also, attempts with the Soviets to sort of project soft power within the UK. And I think one of the ones that I find really interesting is the visit of Yuri Gagarin to the UK. Now, from what I understand, he was invited by a trade union.
Yeah.
So it's a private visit, and the government thought, oh, God, we're looking a bit out of step here, and eventually invited him to Downing Street and to see the royal family.
That's right. That's absolutely right. It's a very, it's important to say the trade union movement of this period is not all communist, right? But it has an element in it that admires the Soviet Union, and they invite Gagarin over. And like you say, the government are sort of a bit taken aback. The thing is, when Gagarin comes, he attracts huge crowds. He visits London and he visits Manchester, and the crowds coming to see him are massive, and he is beloved. And the thing with Gagarin is, already at this point, we're depicting this really cold Soviet bloc, the images of Stalin and people like that, and Khrushchev. But Gagarin comes and he's incredibly charming. He's very, very handsome, dressed perfectly in his military uniform. He's this great smile. All the boys in the crowd want to be him. They all want to go to space because this is the greatest, coolest thing that's ever happened, right? This amazing technological achievement. They don't see it as an ideological struggle. And the women are just swooning at him. He looks like a movie star. And see, he's very humble. And he has a kindly face, and he makes a huge impact. And it's one of those little moments in time you look back and you go, that's a kind of sliding doors moment. There could have been some kind of, element of early détente there, but of course it doesn't happen. The space race becomes massively politicized and fear. But Gagarin's visit is one of those great ones. There's other ones. I mean, the Edinburgh Festival invite Dmitry Shostakovich over, which is a huge moment. There's a real boom in Russian literature in the early 60s, people, not discovering for the first time, but rediscovering Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and these kind of authors. So it's an interesting sort of Russian culture. But it goes way back to 1945 when, of course, we're still allies. And, of course, there's obviously tensions, but, the British public view the Soviets really favourably. And as part of that, the Russian football champions, Dynamo Moscow, are invited over for a tour. And they come and they play Chelsea, first of all, at Stamford Bridge. And there's like 100,000 people there. There's photographs of folks sat on the roof of the stadium. And it's a really interesting game because they come and they give flowers to the Chelsea players, which is very un-English football. And of course, bear in mind, England claims to be the home of football. Those of us in the know it's actually Scotland, but that's a different discussion for another day.
Another podcast.
Yeah, don't worry. If you ever see me in the street, I will bore you to death with that one. But England is seen as the home of football. They're very keen to come and play, and they play Chelsea in the first game, and the Russians play this lovely passing football, very different to the English style of the time, and they make this great impression. They then go to Cardiff and they play Cardiff, who are, a division below, and there's a whole trade union thing here, and there's a workers thing going on. But then they go and play Cardiff and they beat them 10-1, and it's seen as very unsporting, and things start to turn a little bit. They then play Arsenal. Now, Arsenal, the team they really wanted to play, like Arsenal were the big team of the time, the Manchester United or the Liverpool, or dare I say it, the Arsenal of that time, right? The club they really wanted to play. But they have to play at White Hart Lane, which was Tottenham Hotspur's ground, Arsenal's great North London rivals, because Highbury is still requisitioned by the army. And this game is horrific. Firstly, it's played in thick fog. It's pretty violent. At one point, the Arsenal goalkeeper is knocked out and has to go off, and there are no substitutes in these days, so they call out for someone to come on and play in his place. And fortunately enough, the Queen's Park Rangers goalkeeper is in the crowd, and he comes out and plays. But there's penalties, there's red cards. It finishes 4-3. It's very bad-tempered, and by this point, the media have started to turn. They play one more match in Glasgow against Glasgow Rangers, which seems to go off without a hitch, but there's plans for a final game against a kind of England select, and that's abandoned, and they go back. And by the time they go back, there's an air of suspicion around how the Soviets have behaved, how they behave on the pitch, how they behave off the pitch. There's loads more to this story, but it's a real crossroads moment. And actually, to come back to something we were talking about earlier, it's when George Orwell writes another one of these op-eds, and he basically decries. He basically says that international sport is a bad thing because it, elicits terrible feelings, and it's where he comes up with the phrase that sport, and in this case football, is war minus the shooting, which again is another phrase that's lasted for a long time. But that's the first kind of attempt to use soft power. It doesn't really work out, but they return to this time and again because there's a lot of interest in Britain from the Soviet Union, and it ends up probably with the great moment where they write in the Soviet newspaper that Margaret Thatcher, they called her the Iron Lady, which they meant as an insult. And of course, Thatcher did not treat as an insult and kind of turned into her entire political brand. So we, you have the Soviets to thank for that as well. But there's all these interactions on a level below the political or the military.
But there's these cultural exchanges going on all the time. I mean, we're sending people from the Royal Shakespeare Company to the Soviet Union, and I think there's that famous. There's a play where Guy Burgess, one of the Cambridge Five, gets into the dressing room of Coral Brown.
That's right, yeah.
And there's a play or a film about that, what that meeting might have been.
Yeah, I've never seen it. I'm aware of it. I'd like to try and find. I don't know if they filmed it or not, and to try and find that out. But I mean, probably the most famous one is the Bolshoi Ballet come to London in 1956, and it's a huge event, and the Queen attends, and Princess Margaret attends, and it's the hot ticket in town. But of course, the Bolshoi Ballet are, I think, just as they leave London, the Soviet tanks roll into Budapest. And it's again one of those great sort of dichotomy moments. Yeah. It's like another one of those points where you think, feels like there's progress to be made here, and then it's all taken away in the blink of an eye.
Yeah. And it's also the same time when British paratroops are dropping into Egypt,
which is exactly
Suez.
Exactly, yeah.
But one of the sections I enjoyed was when you got onto 80s music, because that's my my period. You talk about Frankie Goes to Hollywood and Two Tribes, which is a real iconic Cold War piece of pop music, because you've got the start of it, you've got this eerie voiceover of Patrick Allen, who had voiced the civil defence films that were going to be broadcast on British TV. And he's voicing some of the opening phrases of that with an air raid siren going in the background. I mean, it's a really haunting opening to a piece of music.
Yeah, it's really powerful. This is the 12-inch Annihilation remix. Now, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, people might not, people that are younger won't appreciate how massive they were. I mean, they're the biggest pop act of the day. That album, Welcome to the Pleasure Dome, is huge. Relax, of course, is this massive controversy. So they're as big as it gets. And they re-release Two Tribes like every few weeks with a new mix, and it stays, near the top of the charts. It sells silly numbers. Feels like everybody owns a copy. The Annihilation remix is the key one, though, because that's where they bring in this. The core track is very clearly a Two Tribes Go to War is the refrain, but the Annihilation remix really doubles down on this and brings in these things, including the Reagan impersonator as well. And I'm not entirely sure, but somebody once told me it was Chris Barry that did it. But I don't know how true that is. I wouldn't want to be quoted on it. But Patrick Allen, as you say, had done the original civil defence films, which are the precursor of the Protect and Survive booklet. And he was brought in, and he basically does it from memory, although he changes it ever so slightly because he'd signed the Official Secrets Act, and he's also very worried that he's going to end up prosecuted. But he does it from memory. That's one of the reasons he does it from memory, so he can alter it a little bit. And it's really powerful. And then, of course, the video is impersonators of Reagan and the Soviet premier in a sumo ring, a wrestling ring. It's very, very funny. But the Annihilation track is incredibly dark. It has those lines about, if a member of your family should die, put them outside, tag, but don't forget to tag them for identification purposes. All these really dark things. But at the same time, it's this like dance floor banger. It's like a great dance track with that Trevor Horn hook through it. So it's really interesting. But the other thing is, like, there are so many of the kind of big acts of the day are reflecting on the Cold War. Now, in the United States, you've got all this great music in the 60s and in the early 70s that are reflecting on Vietnam, for example. And we don't have that in the same way. There's songs like We Got to Get Out of This Place by the Animals, who are obviously a Newcastle band, very much an English band, but they are really looking at America. By the time you get to the 80s, though, there's a lot of these great acts from Britain are reflecting on the Cold War, and particularly the renewed fears around nuclear war that come in that period of Reagan and Thatcher and the pre-Gorbachev Soviet Union. So, you've got Queen, U2, and admittedly not a British band, although, British Isles certainly. Kate Bush has a great track. Sting's doing a track called Russians. Sometimes if you go into academia and they'll talk about music and things, and it'll be stuff that is fairly obscure and has been taken on a greater resonance. This is as mainstream as it gets at the time, charting high. And the other great one, of course, is German one, but it's huge in Britain. That's the key thing. The book is all about Britain, and I know this is a German group, but Nina's 99 Luft Balloons or 99 Red Balloons is a massive hit in Britain. I think that's where it sells the most records, and it's a huge hit all over the world, but in Britain it's especially big. And this is like, you're talking number one, top of the pops, as mainstream as it gets.
Now, we can't talk about the British experience of the Cold War without mentioning The War Game and Threads, two unbelievably disturbing films for their time, and still very haunting if you watch them now.
Yeah, and I believe certainly Threads is on BBC iPlayer for the foreseeable future. I don't know about The War Game, although they did recently re-show it. The War Game is a film by a great filmmaker called Peter Watkins, who made his name with another brilliant film called Culloden, which is a really innovative approach to covering a 18th century battle as if it's happening live with news footage. And it's really worth checking out. That's a huge success, critically acclaimed, very popular, wins loads of awards. So essentially gets almost a blank check to do whatever he wants to do next. And he wants to make a film about nuclear war. And he develops this pseudo-documentary called The War Game, which is made in 1964 and then is due for release, and the BBC shelve it. It's too disturbing. It does play at the what is now the BFI, the National Film Theatre, and it does play in America in the festival circuit, and actually wins the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, although again, it's not really a documentary.
And C&D groups have it as well.
They do.
So they're showing it at meetings, and that's when I first saw it. I went along and
so it has this afterlife despite being officially shelved. And if you go to the archives on this, the correspondence on it is amazing. The internal debates from the BBC. There are a lot of people at the BBC really want it shown, but absolutely there's no chance it's going to happen. So it lives on in limited circles, and people are aware of it, and it's this great what if. And it actually shows 20 years later, around the same time that the BBC have brought out, but at the same time BBC have made their next kind of nuclear apocalyptic film, which is Threads. Now, Threads is, for my money, the most frightening film I've ever seen. It's incredibly realistic. It's set in and shot in Sheffield. The actors don't feel like actors. It's incredibly naturalistic. It looks like a cross between kind of kitchen sink dramas and EastEnders and Coronation Street. And I don't mean that to belittle it. I mean, it feels like everyday life. And it's incredibly terrifying. I don't want to get into the details of it because I really want people who haven't seen it to watch it. Although watch it during the day. And maybe watch a Disney something after it to reset yourself a little bit. But it's incredibly powerful. And it plays as part of a season around the anniversary of... Well, it plays, then it plays again as part of a season around the dropping of the anniversary of the dropping of the bomb. That would be the 40th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb, alongside the war game. It's like, I can't remember if it's consecutive nights, but it's together. And it has a huge impact. Now, I'm not entirely sure the viewing figures, but they're pretty big. I mean, by modern standards, they're huge. But it's still a relatively niche thing. But it's not shown again very often. I think it's only shown another sort of 2 or 3 times in the next 20, 25 years. And say now it exists on, Blu-ray, and you can stream it on BBC iPlayer. But it held this, like the people that saw it were so badly frightened by it that it kind of as another relaunch of the anti-nuclear movement.
It's safe to say it's not a date movie.
No,
that one.
No. And of course the other one is When the Wind Blows, the adaptation of the Raymond Briggs kind of graphic novel or comic strip, which is an animated film. So, I mean, I have a short time worked in a shop that sold records and DVDs and things, and I do remember seeing a little kid picking it up and the grandmother unaware of what it was. We'll get you that one. And I'm like diving like Kevin Costner in The Bodyguard to knock it out of the hand, going, don't do it. Because it's a particularly, grim and really moving.
It's very moving, that.
And again, it's soundtracked by David Bowie and Roger Waters. I mean, huge names. But those 3 really almost make a kind of trilogy. But certainly the War Game and Threads are ones to, you must see stuff.
I think I might still have it, actually. I had a compilation album called War in the European Theatre, and it was made in the 80s, and it was loads of bands with nuclear war apocalyptic theme songs. So you had Going Underground. There might have been a Nola Gay on there. The Stranglers. It was a really, really interesting album, and some great songs.
You've touched on it there. I mean, these are songs people like hum in the car, right? Going Underground by the Jam and London Calling by the Clash. I mean, these are like totemic.
Yeah, that was on there.
And they all, even if you don't know it, they're all touching on nuclear war. The one I always come back to is Ghost Town by the Specials, which has been claimed by multiple different, lots of different interpretations around that. But to me, when I listen to it, it's very much a kind of post-apocalyptic thing. I'm going to plug a little bit. I did do a playlist for the book, which you can find on Apple Music and Spotify, which goes through a lot of these songs that either are in the book or touch on the themes of it, which was a little bit of a personal indulgence, to be honest, because it's great fun to do, but it gives you a flavour of some of these things.
We'll definitely link to that. The book is called Cold War Britain, 50 Years in the Shadow of the Bomb. It's published by Collins, and you've been listening to Fraser McCullum. We have only scratched the surface of the book here. There's loads more detail in it. I really enjoyed it. And if you want to buy it, there'll be links in the episode information, which will help to support the podcast. Thank you, Fraser, for coming on Cold War Conversations.
No, thank you for having me. It's real good fun.
The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening and look forward to seeing you next week.